Landing on Vulcanus can feel familiar for about 10 seconds, and then the planet makes the point fast. This isn't Novi. This isn't a place to look for iron patches and start smelting. Vulcanus matters for a different reason. Vulcanus isn't about more mining, it's about a new production method. It's a new world, a world built around heat and magma, with terrains that fights clean, perfect grids. Flatland is limited, routes are constrained, and beyond the safe landing zone lives the locals, demolishers, which define where building is even possible until the territory is cleared. So the question isn't where the smelters go, it's what does a working Vulcanus start actually look like? What's the goal here and what should happen first after landing? How does power get stabilized quickly enough to keep production running? How does the planet transition from importing plates to producing metals locally? And what are the key unlocks worth living with? Vulcanus isn't a side quest, it's a progression gate. And the moment it clicks, the whole game opens up. One reason to go is science. Vulcanus is where metallurgic science enters the picture, and that matters because it isn't just another pack, it's a pack that unlocks a new tier of industrial tech, the tools that let the factory stop feeling fragile and start scaling with confidence. The bigger reason is the tech jump that comes with it. Turbo belts, or the green belts, raise the throughput ceiling. That means the same factory can move far more material without doubling its footprint. Builds that used to need multiple parallel lines can often be simplified with fewer messy merges and less belt sprawl just to keep up. The big mining drill changes how expansion feels. Instead of constantly adding more outposts and more train stops to chase raw throughput, each mining site becomes a heavier hitter. Fewer structures for the same output, longer patch life, and a smoother path from its rocks to its scales. Then there's the Foundry, which is the real shift in production style. Vulcanus pushes the factory away from ore-in, plates out, and towards molten metal logistics. Foundries make casting happen at scale, which enables compact forge hubs, molten streams in, high volume plates and intermediates out, with layouts that are tighter, cleaner, and easier to grow. On top of that, Vulcanus progressions tends to come with trains and logistic structures that matter because the planet forces a different approach. The terrain isn't friendly to perfect grids, and the routes between usable areas are constrained. So the unlocks aren't more speed, they're tools that makes moving materials on Vulcanus actually practical. This planet can catch you off guard because it doesn't just look different, it forces a different way of building. The first shock is the environment. The planet is warm, harsh, and covered in magma. It isn't a place where water shapes the map and power starts with boilers and lakes. Everything here is designed around heat, fluids, and casting. Planning stops being where's the nearest lake and becomes how do routes weave around lava fields and where can the factory actually sit. Then the terrain hits. Vulcanus is extremely hilly and that changes the feel of logistics immediately. Rail routing becomes a real puzzle because the obvious straight line often isn't possible. Instead of laying down a clean grid and expanding in neat blocks, the base naturally becomes platforms. Flattish buildable areas where real production happens, connected by corridors where rails, belts, pipes, and power squeeze through the few routes that actually work. And then there's the hostile creatures, demolishers. The safe landing area matters because it's the one place where building can begin without instantly triggering a problem. Outside that safe zone, demolishers effectively define where expansion is allowed early on. They change the mindset from wall it and defend it to avoid, route around, and deliberately claim space before building anything permanent. That leads to a couple of early rules that makes Vulcanus feel manageable. Expansion works best when it follows safe corridors rather than trying to sprawl in every direction, and when resources are far away, building an outpost isn't a quick copy-paste job. The terrain makes it take a real effort, longer routes, awkward station placement, more careful planning, and more infrastructure just to make the supply line reliable. Vulcanus has one defining twist: it breaks the normal Novi recipes for getting started. There are no iron ore patches, no copper ore patches, no uranium, and no oil fields. And that one fact rewrites the whole plan, because the usual Factorio loop is to mine ore, smelt plates, scale up, but it doesn't exist here. There is no point walking around hunting for the perfect iron patch, and there's no just add more furnaces solutions waiting later. So it forces a different habit. Every early build needs a clear input story from the start. On Novi, it's easy to place a production line and assume mining and smelting will catch up. On Vulcanus, if the inputs aren't planned upfront, the line simply never runs. Task 3 is usually one of two options. One option is imported basics, temporarily, bringing in plates and a few essentials can smooth the landing and get the first infrastructures online. It's useful as a bridge, but it's not the long-term strategy because shipping bulk materials forever is expensive and fragile. The better option is switching to Vulcanus native replacements as quickly as possible. The planet has its own way of producing the metals that everything depends on, and once local plate production is stable, the entire logistics problem flips. Instead of constantly importing iron and copper just to function, imports shrink down to only the specialist items that can't be made locally yet. So that raises the obvious question, if the factory still needs iron and copper for everything, where do they come from? The answer is that iron and copper don't disappear, the source changes. Plates still dominate almost every recipe: belts, inserters, assemblers, rails, ammo, science chains. It all collapses back to iron and copper. So even without ore patches on the map, a metal backbone is still required. The difference is that production isn't built around miners and smelters, it's built around magma and casting. Magma becomes the backbone for producing molten iron and molten copper. Instead of a familiar ore-to-furnace pipeline, the base shifts into a different shape, closer to a refinery world. Fluids matter more, pipes and pumps matter more, and the metal moving around the factory is often a molten stream, not a belt of ore. A useful way to structure this is as a forge hub. It starts with a clear set of inputs, magma plus the supporting resources that enable the chain. Then comes processing, converting that magma into molten metal and buffering it. Those molten buffers matter because they prevent the system from stalling every time demand spikes or one-step hiccups. Then comes the output, cast plates, and where it makes sense, cast intermediates too. Anything that removes bulky imports and keeps local production flowing. One practical rule makes the whole approach smoother: cast near the consumer. Shipping molten metal or plates across difficult terrain adds complexity fast. If the biggest demand for plates is around the mall, the station yard, or a specific production block, it's often cleaner to place casting right there and keep molten transport short unless you have to transport calcite instead. So the mindset shift is simple: it is unfired ore and smelt it, it is stack magma, make molten metal, buffer them, and cast where the factory actually needs the material. Once molten metals are on the table, the next step is locking down the resources that make the whole planet run. 3 inputs matter more than everything else early on, because they decide whether production is stable or constantly stalling. Calcite is at the top of that list. It isn't a nice upgrade resource, it is a backbone input. It feeds power through acid neutralization and shows up in key processes, which means it gets consumed continuously, not occasionally. If calcite supply dips, power dips, and when power dips, everything else starts falling in a chain reaction. That's why the early priority is simple: secure a steady calcite line before chasing anything optional. Overbuild it, buffer it, and treat it like fuel. Then tungsten is a progression resource. It's rarer, it's tied into advanced recipes, and it's one of the reasons the trip is worth making in the first place. The catch is that it can't just be mined whenever, it requires the big mining drill. So the practical approach is to treat tungsten like a milestone, locate it early, plan the route and station footprint, and build the rest of the planet in a way that works towards unlocking and supplying that drill. And finally, there's sulfuric acid, which is the other half of the easiest early steam setup: acid neutralization. The key idea here is that sulfuric acid isn't a random chemical input, it's part of the power system. If acid supply fluctuates, steam production fluctuates, and power starts pulsing. That's why the early priority is extraction plus buffer tanks. Big buffers smooth out interruptions and makes your power generation more reliable. The mindset for these 3 is straightforward: calcite and sulfuric acid keep the lights on, and tungsten is a progression gate that the whole build is quietly working toward. Power is the first thing that has to feel boring. If the grid is unstable, everything else becomes a constant firefight. Miners stop, pumps stop, casting stalls, belts drain, and progress slows to a crawl. The good news is that this planet gives 2 very strong power options, and they fit together perfectly. Solar is absolutely good here because it gets a 400% bonus that changes the entire economics of early power. A field that would feel nice but slow to scale on Novi becomes a cheap baseline power that can be expanded in simple chunks. No fuel logistics, no fluid handling, no supply line that can break. Just place more panels, connect them, and the steady part of the load is covered. A clean pattern is to use solar for the always-on demand. the inserters, the baseline machines that should never flicker, and then use steam as a flexible layer on top. Steam covers the moment that solar heats, jump-starting a new block, running hydro during expansions, or keeping critical production online when the factory is spiking. Steam is also different here. Instead of boilers next to water, the easiest early method is acid neutralization. The idea is straightforward: calcite plus sulfuric acid produces steam. What makes this so practical is that both inputs can be extracted locally, so the steam setup doesn't depend on importing fuel or hunting for water. You only need a calcite patch and a sulfuric acid geyser. The practical setup is simple and very reliable when it's built with buffers. Start by tapping a sulfuric acid source and routing it into buffer tanks. The tanks matter because they smooth interruptions and stop the power system from pulsing. Then feed calcite in, by belts if it's closed, by rail if it's not, into chemical plants running acid neutralization. The steam output goes straight into turbines or engines, and that becomes the backbone that supports industry blocks when demand rises. You can also output the steam into tanks to create an extra buffer to better handle power spikes. Most early power failures comes from two predictable mistakes. One is calcite starvation, steam production dips, the grid burns out, and the whole factory starts stuttering. The other is no buffering, the factory demand swings, steam supply swings with it, and the grid pulses instead of staying stable. Buffer the acid, overbuild the calcite supply, buffer the steam, and power stops being a problem, which is exactly what's needed on day one. Once power is stable, the next bottleneck shows up immediately: movement. It doesn't matter how good the casting and steam loops are if the resources can't be moved reliably between buildable areas. That's why trains matter a lot more here than on a normal flat grid world. Hills don't just make things look messy, they force real detours, and those detours add up fast when key resources are spread out. On top of that, expansion space is effectively segmented. There are safe buildable areas, and then there are areas that require deliberate routing and planning before serious infrastructures can go down. The result is that the distance between places worth building can be surprisingly large. This is where it starts to feel like the planet is fighting the rail blueprint. A rail book designed for flat land assumes straight lines, big intersections, and clean blocks. Here, the best route is usually a corridor that exists because it's one of the few paths that's actually workable. That changes the mindset. Instead of stamping down a giant network all at once, the goal is to create a small number of reliable corridors that can be extended over time. This is also where the planet-specific train tool starts to matter. There are special rail and terrain solutions that get unlocked and used to make movement practical, and they influence how routes are chosen and stations are placed. Rather than building one huge complex set of mega junctions, it's usually cleaner to plan fewer intersections and keep traffic flowing through predictable corridors, a main line, deliberate branches, and station yards placed where the terrain actually gives enough space. Later, terrain removal becomes part of the toolbox through blue explosives. This is the moment where routing stops being purely reactive. Instead of permanently accepting every hill and choke points, it becomes possible to edit the planet, opening straighter corridors, creating space where stations fit, and making expansions less constrained. The catch is logistics. Blue explosives may be crafted off-world, or the ingredients may need to be imported until local production can support them. The best time to use them is when the terrain is blocking something that will matter for a long time. If a corridor is going to carry critical resources for the rest of the playthrough, unblocking it is worth the cost. The other big use case is clearing and flattening space for major expansions, especially when a forge hub or station yard needs room and the terrain is the only thing preventing clean growth. So what's the opening plan that turns the landing site into a real base? Landing is where the whole planet either becomes smooth or becomes a grind. The goal in the first phase isn't build big, it's to get the minimum set of systems online so everything else can scale without constant fixes. The first step is stabilizing the basics, and that starts with power. A small solar starter gets the baseline running immediately, and a backup steam blocks covers the moments when demand spikes. Building, crafting, expanding. Alongside that, an initial mini-mall matters more than it sounds. Belts, inserters, pipes, power poles, and bots if available are what turns the landing site from a crash camp into a place that can actually build infrastructure. Without those essentials, every expansion becomes slow and manual. Once the basics are online, the next move is to scout and lock down the key local resources. Calcite is the first one to identify and route. because it gets steam power and several critical processes. Then comes sulfuric acid, not just find it, but buffer it with tanks so the power system stays steady instead of pulsing. And even if tungsten can't be mined yet, finding its location early is still important, because it influences where corridors and future rail routes should go. The map planning starts here, not when the drill is finally unlocked. With those inputs identified, the focus shifts to establishing the core loop, the set of systems that keeps everything running without imports doing all the work. That usually begins with the acid neutralization steam loop, because it's reliable, local, and easy to scale when calcite and acid are stable. From there, molten metal production comes online, magma in, molten iron and copper out, buffers included so production doesn't stall whenever something fluctuates. Then comes the part that makes the landing feel solved, the first casting and crafting outputs that noticeably reduce imports. Iron and copper plates are the obvious starting point, because once plates are local, almost every other build becomes easier. From there, tungsten starts to enter the picture through products that matters for progression. Tungsten carbide is a great early target because it's a stepping stone into the tungsten chain. And if carbon isn't local yet, it can be bridged with imports from space at the start, then replaced later with local production once the setup is ready. Tungsten plates follow as a key ingredient for higher tier recipes, including the ones that unlock the real mobility upgrade, turbo belts. And finally, circuits come in, green and red, not because they're glamorous, but because they're everywhere. Once circuits are being produced consistently, the question, can this be built here, flips into how fast can it be built here. So the landing plan is essentially stabilize power and essentials, secure calcite and acid with buffers, locate tungsten for future routing, then bring online the core loop, steam, molten metals, casting, until imports shrinks from bulk plates down to only a few temporary bridging ingredients. Once the landing site is stable, the first goal is simple: make living possible without the planet falling apart the moment attention shifts elsewhere. That starts with planning ahead, because a few items are genuinely painful to bootstrap from zero: blue circuits, low density structures, rocket fuels, spare power. These don't feel like progression when they're missing. They feel like busy work. Bringing a small stock lets the landing start with real expansion, instead of spending hours recreating basic tools and build capacity from scratch. From there, the key shift is crafting locally and shrinking the import list aggressively. Plates are bulky and constantly needed, so the best moment to reduce dependency is as soon as casting is running. Instead of importing endless iron and copper just to function, imports should collapse down to only the small missing inputs that unlock local chains. A compact local mold fed by the first cast plates is what makes that real. Belts, inserters, pipes, poles, and the basic build tools should be available on demand, not limited by delivery schedules. Before leaving, the base needs to be safe to ignore. Power should be in surplus, not balanced on a knife's edge, so new blocks turning on don't cause brownouts. Calcite and sulfuric acid should be buffered so steam production stays steady instead of pulsing, and at least one dependable production block should be running for the return trip. Low density structures, rocket fuels, and blue circuits, when those are stable, launching a rocket back to the spaceship stops being a scramble and becomes a repeatable option, which is exactly what ready to leave should mean. Once getting back to orbit is solved, the real value is what leaves with the cargo. The point isn't to build a second main base that needs constant attention, it's to turn this planet into a source of upgrades that change the rest of the playthrough. The exports that matter are the ones that don't really have substitutes elsewhere. Turbo belts raise the transport ceiling across every factory, foundries unlock the molten metal production style and let casting scale cleanly, big mining drills change how mining outposts feel, turning fewer sites into higher output assets, and metallurgic science is the research engine that pushes the whole tech tree forward from this point. These are two main ways to approach exporting, and they lead to different shape of factory decisions. One approach is exporting finished building and items that keeps interplanetary logistics simple: ship the foundries, ship the drills, ship stacks of turbo belts, ship the science packs. It's a clean inject the tech model. Other planets get the benefits immediately without needing to recreate the full production chain. This is especially strong when the network is still developing and reliability matters more than elegance. The other approach is exporting the production method. Instead of shipping large volumes of finished goods, foundries get placed on the consumer planet and only the necessary inputs get shipped to keep them running. This can reduce shipping volumes long term and make certain planets feel more self-sufficient, but it depends heavily on how strong and reliable the logistics network is, because the method only works if the inputs arrives consistently. Success looks like a stable forge world that doesn't demand babysitting, the core loops keep running, exports are produced predictably, and trips back are occasional and purposeful, not emergency visits to fix yet another stalled supply chain. And that's the real end state, a stable forge world that quietly produces the upgrades that change everything else, turbo beds, foundries, big mining drills, and the science that pushes the tech tree forward. If this helped, hit like, subscribe for more videos, and comment with your approach. Is it better to export finished items, or explore the production method and build foundries on the consumer planet? Let me know in the comment and see you soon for another video.